Hey everyone, and welcome to Aroma Explore the Wheel. This month we will be diving into berries. So this month we are on berry one, and thank you all for joining me tonight. And yeah, let's get into it. There's going to be some of our front matter that you're already familiar with. If you have been here before, if this is your first time, welcome. I'm very happy to have you here, and I hope you find this to be fun and valuable. So before we get started, if you this is your first time here, what we're going to do is you'll need your vials in front of you that you have. We're going to get to those in a little bit, but I like to just let you know you're going to need those caps off, the little white pluggy guy unplugged, and all of that. So let me, here we go. All right. Before we get started, as always, by continuing to agree to stay in this webinar, you are agreeing to the code of conduct. You can find the code of conduct on my website. It was also available in the link that you received today with tonight's webinar link in it. Basically, don't be mean to each other. Don't be mean to me. There's no tolerance for that. Here, if you see a violation of the code of conduct, you can put it in the comments. You can contact me directly. Just let me know. But we're always a pretty chill group, so I'm not too worried about it. But, you got to have that code of conduct. So tonight, it's going to look like how our other webinars have been structured if you've been here. We're going to start with our warm-up routine, kind of our centering routine that we've been working on. Then we'll go into our first blind smelling exercise. That's where I will give you 5 minutes to smell through the vials that you have. I have a form that you will go in and fill out with what you think it is, which aromas go with which vials. Then we'll have a flavor discussion. Tonight we are actually, now that we're coming up to the very end of the fruity part of the flavor wheel, are going to discuss fruit in beer. And so that will be our flavor discussion tonight. Then we'll do another blind smelling exercise, same vials, just give you another shot at it. And then also, of course, Q&A. Now, like everything else, like all of our other webinars, if you have questions during the webinar, you can go ahead and put those in the comment box. I will see them. And I'm happy to take comment or take questions as we go. But if you prefer to wait until the end, that's fine too. All right, so we're going to go into our pre-evaluation routine. For those of you who are new, the purpose of this routine is I encourage you to take the space that we're about to take to develop a routine for when you're about to evaluate, anything. Anytime you're wanting to deliberately or mindfully evaluate something, I want you to form a routine, and doing so is going to help you calm your nervous system. It's going to help you focus your mind on the task at hand, and you're going to signal to yourself that it's time to evaluate. And that one is really important because, this is a ritual that I encourage you to create. And when you create it and you're practicing it and you're doing it ahead of, anytime you evaluate, you will find that once you start doing this pre-evaluation routine, you just kind of can drop right into what you're doing, right? You've signaled to your brain's like, all right, got it, heard. We're going to do something very mindful right now. So some suggestions that I have for you. And again, for those of you who are new, the purpose of walking through this pre-evaluation routine is not for you to do exactly what I do, to have like an identical routine, because my pre-evaluation routine works for me. I want you to take this time to figure out what kind of pre-evaluation routine will work for you. And if one doesn't really resonate, try another one and just keep trying it until you've kind of gotten something together that you can do again before any time you're going to evaluate something. And that you can also do, maybe a minute or so. And I also kind of encourage people, like, do, in your routine, maybe consider all the different places you can be when you're doing that routine, and have it be, maybe something that you can do while seated. If you want to get up and do like jumping jacks or whatever, that's your business. But if you're in like an exam environment or a judging environment, maybe you don't want to be that person. So just some things to think about. What I do for my routine is I will first start with kind of stretching out my neck a little bit, just getting that a little loose. I tend to, like most of us, stare at a screen all day. I also tend to get really tense. So for me, relaxing my shoulders, kind of rolling them out, shaking them out, kind of moving my neck around, that's helping release muscle tension. And that's also signaling to my brain, like, okay, cool, we're relaxing now, right? We don't need to be tense. We know what we're doing here. I might also do like some shoulder stretches. I usually like to give my lats a good quick stretch, whatever, anything you can do to just kind of release tension in your body. And, when you release that tension, that's going to signal to your brain, okay, we're releasing tension. The next thing that I would suggest is some kind of a breathing technique. So the two breathing techniques that we've talked about the most in these webinars are box breathing and alternate nostril breathing. Again, these are not the only breathing techniques that are out there. These are two of the most popular. I have found them both to be effective. And that's why I suggest maybe starting with those. But box breathing, if you're not familiar, you're going to inhale for a count of 4. And when you're inhaling, I really encourage you to focus on inhaling from your diaphragm rather than, most of us breathe pretty shallowly just into our lungs. But with box breathing, you're going to take a deep inhale for 4 seconds. You're going to hold that breath for 6 seconds. You're going to exhale for 7 seconds, and then you're going to just pause for 1 second at the very bottom of that breath, and then you're going to start it again. With alternate nostril breathing, your goal is to always be exhaling on your, I always say like your new nostril. It's super easy to do. You just plug one nostril, breathe in and out, and then you switch nostrils. You breathe in, you breathe out, and you continue to switch. Like I said, usually about like a minute or so to do that. And also when you're doing that alternate nostril breathing, if that is what you choose to do, again, remember you want to breathe from your diaphragm. Don't just breathe into your chest. The last thing I do in my pre-evaluation routine is I set my intention. I visualize what I'm about to do. I tell my brain, okay, here's what we're doing right now. So maybe, for example, tonight, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but when you all are doing kind of this routine, my routine is like, I'm going to thoughtfully and clearly explain whatever tonight's topic is to the webinar participants. So I'm doing my own pre-evaluation routine over here. But other ones, let's say you're going into an exam. Maybe, I'm going to evaluate these samples in front of me to determine what off flavors they may have or what beer style they may be, right? So whatever you're doing, make it specific and use this time that you're releasing tension and you're breathing to just kind of go over in your head, remind yourself, what is it that you're doing? And that's really important because it's going to help you stay focused, particularly in exams, in judging. There's a lot of stuff going on. You're usually under a time crunch, and just taking that time to remind yourself, this is what I'm here to do. This is what I'm doing right here in front of me right now. Say if you're taking like an exam where you have multiple tasting panels, right? Or if you're judging, of course, you're going to have multiple panels. So just taking that time to focus is also going to help you from kind of letting everything snowball with everything else you're going to have to do that day. So what we're going to do now is take about a minute and go through your pre-evaluation routine. And I'm going to be doing the same. Okay, take just a few more seconds. All right, everyone. I promise I'm still here. I'm just having a little bit of audio difficulty, so give me just a couple of seconds.
I'm seeing movement on the little icon.
All right. Hey, everyone. Sorry about that. I seem to be experiencing some audio issues. So if you are able to hear me, I would love for you to tell me that you can hear me. Similarly, if you cannot hear me, tell me that too. All right. Thank you, everyone. Can you, I hate to be this person, can you hear me now? Also, I forget I'm on a little bit of a delay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Sorry about that, everyone. So, um, I hope that your pre evaluation routine went a little more smoothly than mine did. But we're back now, and I've got a different set of headphones, so hopefully I won't lose audio again. So, here we are. We're at our very first blind smelling exercise. So, like I mentioned in the very beginning, you'll want to have your vials in front of you. Go to our blind tasting form. You can use that QR code. You can also use this bit.ly code. And what I want you to do is on the bottom of each one of your vials, there is a 3-digit code. So I want you to enter in that 3-digit code, give the vial a smell, and type in what berry aroma you think is in there. So you should have 4. We're still going to take 5 minutes. And again, progress, not perfection. We're not here to like ace learning, right? So progress, not perfection. And also this time I will not do you dirty, and I will remember that I have this whole list of berries.
So the samples you have in front of you are on this list, and I will let you all take 5 minutes to go through. And when you're finished, make sure you hit submit, but go ahead and leave that window open because we'll be using that form again in a little bit. So 5 minutes, blind smelling starts now.
All right, so that has been 5 minutes. If you haven't already, finish up with your vials and submitted your form, please go ahead and do that. And we will move on to our flavor discussion. So it's funny that I kind of joked about it earlier that, we're almost finished with this fruity section of the flavor wheel and we're finally talking about adding fruit to beer. And that, for me, it was kind of like, I don't know if I want to talk about that. It just seems so obvious. But then, I always remember like obvious to one person is not necessarily obvious to everyone. And, there is a lot to learn about adding fruit to beer. And actually in preparing for this, I learned quite a bit more about like the actual mechanics of doing so than I knew before. So, you just got to stay one lesson ahead of the students, I guess. All this to say that I thought I just found out a lot of really cool information. So I'm excited to share that with you all tonight. So I think most of us are probably familiar with the types of fruit additions used in brewing. We won't go too in depth into any of them, but there are a few considerations that we'll talk about. So, this also kind of fell into I feel like people know this, but it's like you know what happens when you assume, right? So I added this in and then like I was finding out more information. And anyway, we will talk through some of these fruit additions and then I'm going to go through some considerations for you when it comes to adding fruit to beer. And like I just mentioned, there were a lot of them that was something that I hadn't necessarily thought about, but was like, oh yeah, that has totally happened to me, or I've had a beer like that. So the kinds of fruit additions that are the most common are going to be fresh, of course, frozen, puree, juice, extracts, concentrates, and zest. And I feel a little bad, like zest, we're not going to talk about zest tonight. We talked about zest a little bit in the webinar that we did where we discussed bitterness, but I kind of feel like out of all of these, everybody probably understands what zesting is. So if you have questions about zesting, feel free to ask. Just know that we're not going to talk about it tonight. So let's talk about fresh fruit. Fresh is best, but the fruit that you find in the grocery store is not usually a very good option. Your best options are going to be fruit that is local, fruit that is fresh, and fruit that is organic or has been like minimally preserved in some way. And one of the reasons why grocery store fruit is fine, if that's the only option you have, I would say you have other better options still. But those fruits are going to be typically picked before they're fully ripe. Whereas if you're getting like fresh seasonal fruit, that's going to be fully ripe, right? And it may be processed in some way to help with shelf stability. So some considerations include when we're looking at fresh fruit and we're thinking about the impact it's going to have on our beer, one of them is going to be the water content. So fresh fruit is going to be 75 to 90% water. It may dilute your beer. Again, there's going to be some things we'll talk about tonight that is like, yeah, it's possible, but in practice, how much are you really going to need to worry about it? This would be one of the things that I would say you probably don't need to be too worried about it. The only, some of the exceptions or some places where we give it more careful consideration is if you had say a really light, really delicate beer and, you're putting like a lot of watermelon or something that has a ton of water in it, then it may be possible to dilute your beer a little bit just with all of that water from the watermelon. Timing. This is a big one, right? Your beer has to be ready when the fruit is ready. When you get that fresh fruit is pretty much, it's like fresh hops, right? You need to be ready to get that fresh fruit and put it right into the beer, however you're going to add it to the beer. So it can be kind of a timing thing. Processing is also going to be an issue. You have sanitation options. One of them, you can throw the fruit in the last few minutes of your boil. That's not recommended. It's not recommended generally because it's not going to give you the flavor profile you're likely looking for because a lot of those volatiles are going to boil off. And also the fruit is going to be fermented with the wort, which means its sugars are going to be fermented. So not only have you lost some of those volatiles, but then you're also decreasing the flavor impact because you just don't have the same profile. So boiling the fruit is, unless you're going for like a cooked fruit flavor, and you might be, in which case that's a good option for you. But generally speaking, we don't want to add the fruit anywhere on the hot side. You can also use Camden tablets. So these are contain high levels of SO2. That SO2, Camden tablets are used a lot in wine for the SO2. In beer, they're usually added to maybe be able to do like a Burton, or I'm sorry, not a Burton ice water. You add your Camden tablets for, I was thinking water and I just went off on totally wrong track. Camden tablets can also take chlorine and chloramines out of your water. That's another area where you might see a brewer using Camden tablets. But Camden tablets will, you crush them up, mix them with some water, put them with your fruit, and that's going to kill any bacteria or anything like that. So Camden tablets is also an option. You can also soak the fresh fruit in alcohol for about an hour and then throw it in. So you have some options, but unless you're going for a truly wild beer, you're probably not going to go like pick blackberries off of the bush and just throw them straight into your fermented beer, right? You're probably not going to do that. There are worlds where you might. But generally speaking, if we're making, like a strawberry wheat beer or something like that, probably not. You also have to prepare the fruit. So this can include de-seeding, de-stemming. You usually want to use some kind of a blender or a muddler to crush up the fruit because you're wanting to make those juices and as much of the fruit available to the beer as possible to get that flavor. So you're going to need to do something to kind of mash it up. Freezing and thawing at least once is recommended. When you freeze fruit, that water as it freezes is going to help rupture the cell walls of the fruit. So again, you're going to have more fruit, more flavor available. And so freezing at least once and then thawing is at least once is recommended. A lot of brewers who will use a lot of fresh fruit will actually freeze and thaw a few times just to really maximize those ruptured cell walls. And freezing will help with the freezing can help with some of the microbes. It will kill some of them. It won't kill all of them. So again, just something to keep in mind. It's also possible that maybe your beer pH is already low enough that when you add that frozen fruit, that if there is anything present, you've got the pH, you've got the alcohol there that will kill it off. A couple of the other things, sorry, I'm just going through my notes here, to say about the boil and why that putting your fruit in the boil isn't recommended. Another thing, like we mentioned, the fruit is going to go with the wort into the fermenter. That fruit obviously has a lot of fructose in it, which is the sugar in fruit. So that fructose is also going to ferment, and fructose can give really unpredictable aromas and flavors. Also, boiling will set the pectins in fruit, which will cause a permanent haze in your beer. So pectins are carbohydrates and they can form gels, and those gels are what leads to a cloudy appearance in beer. So that permanent haze. So we have permanent versus temporary haze. So this is going to be permanent haze. I bet you can guess by the name, it does not go away, unlike temporary haze, which will. So that is our fresh fruit. Other fruit additions worth talking about. Frozen fruit. So the difference between fresh and frozen fruit is going to be that frozen fruit more than likely has been flash frozen at its peak ripeness. So you're going to get it in better condition. Like I just mentioned, freezing is going to help break down the cell walls. You do need to allow, and I didn't say this on the last one, you do need to allow the fruit to thaw before adding it to the fermenter, because you don't want to take frozen fruit, right, something that's very, very cold, and put it into the yeast environment where that yeast has a temperature range where it likes to work, that's a very delicate window of temperature range. Like there's not a yeast strain out there that can work between 50 degrees and 100 degrees, right? It's usually like a maybe 10 to 15 degree window that the yeast is going to work the best at. So if you take frozen fruit, throw it into your beer, you're going to lower the temperature and you're going to damage your yeast. So let it thaw. Puree is probably the best option, I would argue, particularly for commercial brewers, people who are wanting to make the same beer consistently over and over again. Puree is really the way to go. Another thing with puree, like you can see here, you have access to fruits that may not otherwise be available to you. You can make the argument that frozen fruit is kind of the same way, but if you go into Amaretti or any of the big like flavoring big puree companies, you will see like, oh, I didn't realize that I ever wanted a beer with prickly pear in it, but now I see I can get a big can of it, so maybe I do, right? So you have access to flavors you may not otherwise have access to. Also, a really great thing about purees, they're aseptically packaged, so they're stable, bacteria free, which means you can open the can and just plop the puree in there. You don't need to do anything to like sanitize the puree the same way you need to do if you're adding fruit in. It's going to provide more surface area. So remember when we were talking about the fresh fruit and I said you need to process it or muddle it, puree has already done that for us. Also, with puree, you're going to get consistency within the puree. You're also going to get consistency within those batches of puree. Whereas if you buy, let's say, plums from your local farmer, maybe, one harvest is great, everything's fantastic. And then the next harvest, like they had to, it was a little like underripe or maybe it was overripe or whatever. So your beer is going to taste slightly different. Even within, a batch of plums, there's going to be variations in the flavor. With something like puree, that has been blended to be a consistent product, and to be a consistent product, no matter, you can buy like 10 different cans of it, it's going to be consistent. It's going to provide less tannin contributions. We're going to talk about tannins here in a couple of minutes. But puree, because we're not adding stems, we're not adding seeds, it's not going to contribute nearly as many tannins as you would get from fresh fruit. Obviously, with puree, it's easier to handle, right? You don't need to worry about like, I need to have 10 people come in and help like deep hit cherries or whatever. You just have kind of stacks of it, and when you're ready for it, it's there. You can measure out what you need. You can store it easily. And I'll also say I didn't get the pictures didn't make it in here, but I did ask some brewer friends for like brewing with fruit pictures, and most of the pictures I got were just of groups of people like looking miserable, doing things like, no joke, just like deep hitting just a room full of cherries. And it didn't really make adding fruit to beer look like that much fun, so I didn't include any of them. But just to say, those were the majority of the pictures I got were very like nonplussed looking people who realized like the enormity of what they committed to. All right, so extracts and concentrates. These are typically going to be less desirable due to artificial or one-dimensional flavors. I think that we've, probably had beers like this. I know one of the first times I judged at the Great American Beer Festival, I had a stout that had blueberries added, which was already a little weird because blueberries, we'll get into this a little bit, but blueberries don't really translate that well into beer flavor-wise. And it was just this really strong blueberry flavor. And one of the other judges was like, yeah, this is obviously like extract. This is just like artificial flavoring added. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, that's what it is. That's what I'm tasting. So it can be less desirable. You might use it though. Let's say that like your blueberry beer isn't really blueberrying as much as you would like. You can add a little bit of extract or a little bit of concentrate or something to kind of help boost that flavor. Generally speaking though, those are not going to be they're just not the best quality and they're not the best option. Also, or I should say on the other hand, one good thing about using something like an extract is the beer is ready immediately after you add the extract, right? It doesn't need any time to age. You don't need to like muddle the extract or anything like that. So a few months ago, I had the pleasure of being able to visit South Africa and judge in the African Beer Cup. And I bring this up because they had a specific category that they had created. Again, they used the BJCP guidelines for most of their judging, but they did create their own guidelines for things like traditional African grains, specialty African grains, and fruit flavored beers. So I was a little confused by the concept of fruit flavored beers when I first saw it, because I was like, yeah, that's a fruit beer. And you can see in this picture, this is a picture that I took of the fruit flavored beer. This was during Best of Show judging. So this was the Best of Show fruit flavored beer. And what it is, it is a beer with extract added to it. And it was a really interesting category. It was an interesting category to judge because in the kind of the overall impression will give you an idea, but this category is not for, your Creek or your, I don't know, pink lemonade IPA or whatever. This is for beers, usually specifically with artificial extracts added to them. It does say they should be recognizable as beer. I think most of you are probably already picturing this, but think of something like a Lindemans Framboise, something like that has been back sweetened. It's very, very similar to that. But I just thought it was interesting. I wanted to include it since I was just talking about how like extracts are not good. They're not good in all contexts, but in this one, I thought that was a neat idea that these beers are designed to be kind of gateway beers for people who are wanting to learn more about beer. And so it's, they've taken that, like they've seen kind of the reality of what their beer community looks like, and they've included this category of fruit flavored beers. And I just thought that was a really cool thing to do and to learn about. Okay, so let's talk about some considerations when we are adding fruit to beer. The first one, obviously, pretty important, right? It's our beer style. Nope. Oh no. Okay, so considerations. Here we go. Oh my God. Okay, so this is, again, very general advice. If you have a delicate fruit flavor, you're going to want a lighter bodied beer because you don't want the beer to show up that fruit flavor. So that might be something like American wheat beer and peaches, Kolsch and strawberries. Peaches, strawberries, and blueberries are three fruits that really break my heart when it comes to beer because their flavor does not translate. It doesn't translate well into a beer. We'll talk about in a few minutes, blueberries don't make your beer blue, but peaches and strawberries are just, and blueberries are very, very faint. Their flavors fade quickly. So it would be, it's not impossible to have something like a strawberry imperial stout. It would just take an enormous amount of strawberries to create a flavor that would then be able to stand up to the flavors like a stout. On the other hand, more intense fruit flavors can handle darker, more complex beers. That's why we see a lot of cherries and raspberries in imperial stouts, right? Because they can hold up, and it doesn't take a lot of them to create a lot of flavor, especially raspberries. They can very, very quickly become overpowering in a beer. So one of the things to consider when we're thinking about the beer style is not just the style, but also the style's balance and how a fruit's acidity and sweetness may affect that balance. For instance, you might want to lower your bitterness by about 10 to 20%. That's because acidity and bitterness are really going to clash with each other. They don't really do well if they're both at high concentrations. And also you want to make sure that you're showcasing that, the kind of the fruit, you're using it for the acidity, for the sweetness, for that flavor. So the bitterness is really going to clash with any kind of acidity that you have, or some acidity. You want to consider the acidity of the fruit. We'll talk about fruit acidity in just a second. what is the sweet versus sour balance going to be? What is this beer style like? What is it going to be like after you add, maybe a highly acidic fruit to it? So let's say, you're adding like grapefruit or something like that. How is that going to change your sweet and sour balance? Also, how is your sour and bitter balance going to be after you've added fruit to the beer style? So it's not only thinking about what the end flavor profile is going to be, but anytime that like we're adding something to beer, you kind of need to do a little reverse engineering to think, is there something I need to take out, or is there something I need to adjust to account for the fact that I am adding this to the beer? So acidity is a big one. Our main acids that are found in fruit are malic, citric, and tartaric. So malic acid is more intense out of the three. It's much more intense than the other two. Malic is the primary acid that you're going to find in apples, watermelons, apricots. You can read the rest. Malic is actually named after the root word for apples. So malic acid is going to give the impression of unripe or green fruit, which, kind of makes sense, I think, because if you've got like a lot of acid in a fruit, chances are it's because it's underripe. And so the idea of, yes, malic acid, when you taste malic acid, you're thinking, okay, this is unripe, this fruit is green. Its acidity, unlike the acidity of some of the others, is going to be harsh and lingering. So it's not necessarily an acidity that you want in your beer. So tartaric acid plays a critical role in wine. It's the most important acid in wine, but it is also obviously in fruit. I bet you can't guess, it's very high in grapes. It is the primary acid in grapes, limes, and bananas. And actually, tartaric acid is usually added to like grape flavored, lime flavored things. That acidity that you're getting, that's added tartaric acid. This can also add astringency to beer. And we'll talk a little bit more about astringency and tannins in just a second. And this is just a little, hey, did you know? Because I always thought like cream of tartar was like, I don't know, cream of mushroom. And so you can imagine my surprise that it is not. But the cream of tartar is the salt form of tartaric acid. So you will see that sometimes in baking or like hard candy confectionery. Citric acid, I think all of us are probably familiar with citric acid because it's the most commonly added to foods and beverages to create a sour taste. So citric acid is going to make your mouth water, whereas some of the other acids, like particularly lactic acid, tends to have a very drying effect on your palate. So that can be a way to tell the difference between your acids. Is my mouth watering or does my mouth feel dry? Again, I know you're not going to believe this, but the citric acid is the primary acid in citrus. I know, it blew my mind too. It can also add astringency to beer. So, keep in mind, like as we're going through this, these are all things that even myself, having been a home brewer, a pro brewer, obviously having like my whole personality be beer for the past several years, these were things that I was like, oh yeah, I didn't even consider that. I was always focusing on what's the finished flavor profile going to be like. So let's talk about malolactic fermentation. Malolactic fermentation happens when any malic acid that is present is converted, i.e., fermented, to lactic acid. So that's malolactic fermentation. Makes sense, right? And this malolactic fermentation is very common in white wines. So if we've got a mixed fermentation beer being that it was fermented with Saccharomyces, with brewer's yeast, or Brettanomyces, but either one or both of those were the primary way of the fermentation. And I completely lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. Mixed fermentation. So that's going to be primary fermentation with Saccharomyces or Brettanomyces or both. And then you're also going to have the presence of something of a bacteria like Lactobacillus or Pediococcus. So that's what a mixed fermentation is going to be. So let's say we have a mixed fermentation. Mixed fermentation necessarily is going to have Lactobacillus and or Pediococcus. So most strains of Lactobacillus and Pediococcus can perform malolactic fermentation. So what that means is that if you've got a mixed fermentation and you're adding fruit into the beer, that can shift that acidity balance from malic acid to lactic acid, but you have to give it time. So that's, again, for mixed fermentation, if you give it enough time, that really harsh malic acid that is not really all that desirable in our beer is going to be converted into that softer, less harsh lactic acid. The other thing to be concerned about here, bacterial malolactic activity can also produce acetic acid and diacetyl in the presence of citric acid. So we have this a whole other consideration. But if we have a mixed fermentation and we are already using Pediococcus, we're necessarily also using Brettanomyces because Pediococcus creates an enormous amount of diacetyl. So that's why we co-pitch Brettanomyces with Pediococcus, is in part because that Brettanomyces is going to convert that diacetyl. So you've hopefully, if you've got a mixed fermentation with Pediococcus in it, you already have Brett. You may not, though, if you just have a Lactobacillus beer. So just be aware that if you're adding fruit and you're adding fruit that's high in citric acid, that malolactic activity can also produce acetic acid and diacetyl. So on the one hand, you'll get that nice lactic acid. On the other hand, you've got acetic acid and diacetyl. So if you've co-pitched with Brettanomyces, it's going to reduce both of those for you, so that won't end up in your final beer, and you'll just have that nice lactic acid. When you do this, Brett does not work quickly, right? Brett likes to take its time, so you need to allow, after you've added fruit to your beer, a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks for all of this malolactic fermentation and then that breakdown of any undesirable compounds by the Brettanomyces to take place. But that's a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks. Really, though, anytime you're working with mixed fermentation, it is kind of like you just make that elaborate mandala in the sand and then just wipe it away. You just have to forget that you have a mixed fermentation beer, because you want to make sure that you give it enough time to ferment and to get all of those interesting flavors. So let's talk about tannins. Tannins are really interesting because they're a way that fruits communicate. So fruits, obviously, I think most of us know this. Fruits need animals to eat their seeds, poop the seeds out, so that way they can proliferate and survive. But they don't want those seeds to be eaten too soon. Therefore, you have unripe fruit, and stems and seeds have higher levels of really harsh astringency. Fruit pulp, or the parts of the fruit that are typically eaten, contain mostly hydrolyzable tannins. Non-edible parts of the fruit, stems and seeds, have high levels of condensed tannins, which can add harsh astringency to beer. So our tannins, polyphenols, they contribute bitterness and astringency to beer. Polyphenols, most of the time, we see through the addition of maybe a lot of hops with a lot of plant matter is carried over. It can also be if you have sparged too hot. If your sparge water was too hot, maybe you leach some polyphenols from those malt husks. Those are usually how you're going to get polyphenols in beer, but if you're adding fruit, be aware that you may also be adding some polyphenols to that. So what happens with that astringency is that our polyphenols bind to and then precipitate the proteins in our saliva, which is going to cause your mouth to feel dry. So that's that astringent feeling. And we just talked about this. We have the hydrolyzable type of tannins. Those can add like a pleasant complexity, some structure, whereas condensed tannins are going to add harsh astringency. Condensed tannins, again, being the ones that are generally going to be found in stems and seeds. So things that you're probably not going to put into the beer anyway. Then we have color, and color is an interesting one because I vividly recall trying to brew a beer with strawberries. Strawberries are my favorite fruit. You can imagine how heartbroken I am that they don't come through very well in beer. But brewing a beer with strawberries in it didn't give me a strawberry colored beer. It gave me this weird grayish, goldish, slightly pink kind of color beer. So it's not like a 1 for 1 in terms of the color in the fruit being the color in the beer. So the fruit compounds that add color to beer are anthocyanins, and those are pH sensitive, and they're going to appear mostly as red, purple, or blue, not blue very often, sadly. Fruit skins also have high levels of these, so you can age your beer on whole fruit skins. You'll get more color extraction, but you'll also increase your tannin extraction. So when a lot of things in beer is a matter of kind of deciding what you're okay with compromising, right? It can be a case of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So again, something to keep in mind, like you might get really great color extraction. You might also get a lot of tannin extraction. And maybe you've accounted for that in your recipe, and you've kind of found a way to I don't know, maybe boost the sweetness or something like that in the beer, so it's not going to be as big of a deal. But it's one of those, like, which one am I more okay with trading off? Beer with low pH. So low pH in this context meaning sour beer, because all beer has low pH. But if you've got something like a sour beer, that's going to cause those pH sensitive anthocyanins to appear red or purple. So if the pH is a little bit higher, maybe your blueberry beer will be a little purpley blue, but generally speaking, it's going to be kind of a reddy purple color. But that's why sour blueberry beers usually are not blue. The beer acidity, again, if you have a lower pH beer, so sour beer, that's also going to help preserve the color compounds. Again, always remember your color is going to be variable. It may not turn out as expected. Like I mentioned, I've been very sad about ways strawberry and blueberry beers have turned out. So this is also another, I think, good argument for using something like puree when you're adding it to a beer, because then you kind of have a better idea, of how it's going to turn out. That's going to be consistent. I worked at a brewery that had a plum saison that was one of their flagships, and it was kind of an issue some years when the plums were different colors. So our beer was also going to be a different color. And, if it doesn't look right, people don't want to drink it. So again, just an argument for puree often being kind of a better choice in situations like this. Of course, we can't forget about flavor. We want to consider that. But what you may not consider is that fruits can have a lot of phenols and a lot of phenolic acids. And actually, I've already started down this rabbit hole. I have an article I printed out about all the different phenols in fruit, so I will report back. Maybe you'll get like an update next month for berry too. If you've got a mixed fermentation, or you can just do a straight fermentation with Brett all the way through, Brettanomyces can convert those phenolic compounds into more classic notes that we think of when we think of Brettanomyces. So kind of barnyard, haystack, funky, those Brettanomyces flavors. However, again, breaks my heart with strawberries. Strawberries can produce phenols that are going to be plasticky, like styrene, medicinal, and Band-Aid. So you can get some of those like bad Brett flavors. And then strawberries just on their own can give you some of those bad flavors, which when I learned this, I did actually flash back to different times I've had like strawberry flavored some kind of beverage in my life and thinking like, this tastes gross. And then learning this, I was like, oh, that's why maybe strawberries aren't meant to, be in beer. They're just supposed to be in my mouth. So if you've got something like a mixed farm beer, you can also do this with, just a regular straight Saccharomyces fermented beer. But if you add a little bit of fresh yeast when you add the fruit, that can combat that creation of off flavors. So diacetyl, acetaldehyde, fusel alcohols. I had this happen to me not with fruit actually, but with a maple syrup barrel. I had been so excited to get my hands on a maple syrup barrel forever. I got one. I made this beautiful wheat wine, tasted great, put it in the maple syrup barrel. I'm going to have this delicious maple syrup barrel aged wheat wine. And when I take it out of the barrel, it has terrible acetaldehyde. I mean, like I put an acetaldehyde spike into it. And I was really confused about that because it tasted great when it went into the barrel. So what happened? And I asked one of my brewer friends about it, and he was like, oh, well, if there's maple syrup still in the barrel, those sugars, the yeast is going, any leftover yeast is going to start fermenting those maple syrup sugars. And so you're not going to have enough yeast to be able to complete a second fermentation, right? So you're going to end up with off flavors. Fruit acts the same way. Anytime you're adding something sugary to your beer, you do need to account for the fact that there may be some yeast left over that is going to start trying to ferment those sugars that it's going to find. And of course, you're probably not going to have, if you haven't done an extra pitch of healthy yeast, then you can have things like diacetyl and acetaldehyde and fusel alcohols. Like I just mentioned, any microbes that are present are going to start fermenting those fruit sugars. And also remember that fermented fructose is kind of unpredictable and definitely doesn't taste good. So you really don't want anything fermenting those fruit sugars. You'll also have the biotransformation. Acids, esters, and phenols will also begin. So again, you want to make sure you've got some fresh, healthy yeast in there to ensure that all of those are dealt with accordingly. Another thing to think about, fruit is going to taste different when all of its sugar is fermented out. If you're wanting to get like a super accurate idea of whatever fruit, maybe let's say it's a fruit you've never tasted in beer before, or maybe it's just your first time using a fruit, you can find recipes online to do like basically like kind of like a quick and dirty fruit wine that will give you an idea of this is what this fruit will taste like after it doesn't have any sugar left. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, right? Because if you're using something that let's say is really, really sweet, all of that sugar or some of that sugar, most of that sugar is going to get fermented. So is that still going to be palatable when there's not sugar left in it? And then alcohol. So alcohol is an interesting one. I included it because it does have the adding fruit does have the ability to change your ABV, but not really by that much. And so we'll talk about it. So, like I just said, the change in alcohol from fruit can usually be ignored in most cases. Is usually not going to change the ABV of your beer drastically, i.e., you're not going to make a 5% beer and add so much fruit that you accidentally end up with a 10% beer, right? That's not going to happen. So for the most part, it's not something that you need to worry about. But generally speaking, if the fruit's sugar concentration is lower than the original gravity of the beer, that fruit addition is going to lower your original gravity. So it's going to reduce the percentage of alcohol in that beer. On the flip side, if the fruit sugar concentration is higher than the original gravity in the beer, the addition is going to raise the original gravity and also increase, therefore, the percentage of alcohol. But let's see what this looks like in practice. So this is our formula for being able to figure out what our fruit addition or how our fruit addition is going to change the ABV of our beer. I'm going to take a sip of my beer while you all memorize this because there will be a test. So let's say You really, really, really want to figure out how this fruit addition is going to change the ABV of your beer. Or let's say you're adding a dump truck full of beer to or a dump truck full of raspberries to like a carboy of beer. So here's what's in our formula. WF is going to be the weight of your fruit in pounds, and this is going to be the weight of the fruit that you're adding. So we're not including pits, stems, and seeds. So let's say you have a lot of peaches that you need to take the pits out of before you put them in your beer. You would want to do that before you weighed them for the purposes of this calculation. Your PF is the Plato of the fruit. If you have a refractometer, you can do it that way. If you do want to check your Plato of your fruit with a refractometer, just remember you need to account for any kind of temperature differences, or a lot of times you can find that information on the packaging, especially if it's like puree or something like that. It will have that information on it. Your PB, the original Plato of the beer, original gravity reading of the beer, the current volume of beer in gallons. And this 8.35 that you see here is a conversion number. So you just plug all that in, multiply it by 8.35. So here's an example. You have 4.5 gallons of 11 Plato beer. You're adding 10 pounds of cherries. So 10 pounds is a not insignificant amount, especially for 4.5 gallons of beer. That is a lot of cherries, actually, now that I'm saying it out loud. So we plug all of that information into our formula, and you can see that that 10 pounds of cherries that we added is only going to increase our ABV by 0.3%. So it's not going to be a ton. That's why, for the most part, conventional wisdom is you don't need to worry about how the fruit addition to your beer is going to affect the alcohol, because in most cases it's going to be very incremental. So that is our adding fruit to beer. I, kind of started down the path of like, and we've mentioned it in here, fruits like strawberries and peaches and blueberries are very delicate. They don't really last that long in beer. They don't really stand out the way you think they will. Obviously, cherries, apples, raspberries, those all have really strong flavors, and you don't need as much. And as I was kind of going through, I just wasn't excited about that. But then I started, like reading and kind of tying together all of these different things that I hadn't really thought about before. Like I mentioned, I'm usually focused on what is the final flavor going to be like, and not thinking about like, oh yeah, the acidity would affect this, or, do I want maybe I do want to pit those cherries, or maybe I don't. There's just all kinds of considerations about adding fruit to beer that's not just throwing fruit into beer. So I hope you all found that interesting. We are going to do our second blind smelling exercise. So what I want you to do is going to be the same way that we did it the first time, with a couple of changes. One, I want you to mix up your vials, just kind of move them around so you're not smelling them in the same order. And two, I'm only giving you 3 minutes to complete this, because you've already made friends with these vials earlier. So you've already kind of familiarized yourself with them. And I'm going to give you 3 minutes. And then we will come back. We'll talk about sources. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. But your 3 minutes to do your second blind smelling exercise will start now. All right, so that has been 3 minutes. If you haven't already, go ahead and wrap up, click submit on that, and we will move on to our flavor reveal. So if you're new, one thing that we've started doing in these webinars during the flavor reveal, I'm going to tell you what the number is, give you a second to find it, then I'm going to tell you what the fruit aroma is. What I would like for you to do after that is smell it and say that fruit out loud to yourself. Just do it a couple times. You know, it can just be like strawberry, strawberry, things like that, because speaking it out loud helps strengthen that connection between the aroma and our memory. So here we go. We are going to start with sample 639. So 639 is black currant. All right, next we have 847. 847 is blueberry. Then we have 855. 855 is elderberry. And last we have 133. 133 is raspberry. And I'm curious to know, as we go through these, you know, for myself, I kind of have my preconceived notions about kind of which groups of fruits I thought were going to be the easiest to identify. It turns out none of them really are when they're in anonymous brown vials, and I can identify them as fruits. So I'm curious, for those of you who have done these before, if you have found kind of one subtype of fruit to be easier to detect than others. I think for me, citrus was probably the easiest one. But definitely with the berries, it's been a little bit tougher than I anticipated, being able to smell the differences between them. All right, as always, this is a list of my sources. This is where I got all of the information that I used to prepare today's presentation. And I will also send this out to you in PDF form, probably not tomorrow, but within the next few days. You will get a copy of these slides as well as the link to be able to watch the video. So I'm on my last slide. If anybody has any questions, now is the time to put it in the comments. If you don't, that's totally fine too. Our next Aroma Explore the Wheel is actually going to be the very last one in our fruity series. That's going to be on August 21st at 8 p.m. That's another Thursday. And if we don't have any comments or questions, know that you can always shoot me an email. I'm not on social media anymore, so if you DM me, I'm not ignoring you, I'm just ignoring social media. So you can email me, you can reach me on my website. There's a ton of ways. Any questions, any comments you have, please, please, please reach out and let me know. And with that, I'm going to bid you okay, and I'm back. So with that, I just like I was like, bye, and just closed out of this. So I'm so sorry. I hope you all have a great night. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope to see you in future webinars, and happy smelling.